It was early conceived by the most sagacious and knowing nations that a number of females had always determined the condition of men by means of their spinning wheels. And had the ladies in every age since ruled in this laudable way, perhaps some nations would be in a far better state than they are now. But be that as it will, I presume there was never a time when, or a place where, the spinning wheel could more influence the affairs of men than at present in this and the neighboring colonies. March 30th, 1769. When talking about what caused the American Revolution, the focus is generally on the Acts of Parliament, the Boston Tea Party, taxation without representation, etc., etc. What is often overlooked is the important role feminine-presenting people played in supporting the cause, proving to others that Americans could survive without England, and providing an economic backbone for the country at war. And they did it through the control and production of textiles. And yes, I know the guillotine earrings are from the French Revolution, not the American, but they were totally interrelated and felt apropos given that we suffer no kings in this space, whether English, French, or otherwise. To understand why the homespun movement was so essential to the American Revolution, first you need to understand the concept of mercantilism, which was a common economic practice in Europe from the 16th through the 18th centuries. Not just a civic to research in Civ 6. The idea was a nation could have a strong economy via a favorable balance in trade, where they would export more than they would import. Part of this involved the British strictly controlling what could be made in the colonies and where they could buy their other products. The year is 1699, and the American colonists are not having fun. Because of the fear that American wool would compete with British exports, the British have just enacted the Wool Act, which prohibited the shipment of woolen fabrics across any colonial boundary. This means that the colonists were prevented from selling or exporting their wool or other raw materials to other countries. In theory, the colonists were to produce the raw materials like wool or cotton, send them over to England to be turned into cloth, and then wait for them to return and buy the finished product. Seems pretty inefficient to me. Now, it's true that the textiles coming from Britain were often cheaper and of much higher quality than they could get in the colonies. And it's also true that the colonies were having issues with wool production, particularly because of wolves, to the point that the colonial government actually enacted a bounty for farmers to keep the wolf population under control. But that the goods were cheaper and nicer was fully orchestrated by the British government in order to protect its interests and control the colonies. This was only one in a series of similar acts enacted in the 17th and 18th centuries in order to control the conversation of trade. They taxed the living bejesus out of the colonists, and it was these taxes that led eventually to revolution. Believe it or not, textiles made up the single largest import from Britain in the 17th and 18th centuries. Much like recent years, when ridiculous and pointless tariffs were put on goods made outside of the United States, and suddenly those of us who are makers were struggling to get fabric and other supplies at reasonable prices, with no hope of domestic production to alleviate the cost, the colonies at that time simply didn't have the equipment to manufacture the textiles themselves. In this case, intentionally prevented by our buddy who spits. And the result? The homespun movement. As tensions rose between the British and the American colonies, the colonists began to reinforce the concept that Americans should be less dependent on the British for manufactures. And because textiles played such an important part of Britain's economic trade, naturally, focus turned to manufacturing cloth at home. You may have heard of the term homespun fabric. Homespun refers to any textiles produced domestically in a non-professional setting. It's not made from one specific cheap fiber, but refers to the act of making it in the home, instead of by a professional with professional equipment. Kind of like eating a nicely prepared dinner from a home cook versus eating a meal at a restaurant made by an actual chef. Unless you're related to a chef, and therefore get the same quality meals at home than you do at a restaurant, but I digress. In the 17th century, homespun was used mostly for utility fabrics like household linens and bed curtains. The work was originally thought to be kind of unfashionable and uncouth. Many people associated it with the poor because it was often a job that was given to people who could not support themselves in other ways. It was also associated with single women with the derogatory term spinster, referring to a woman who spun cloth for a living instead of being dependent on a man. Gods forbid. In the late 1760s, after some political squabbling, the Virginia Association formed and encouraged Virginians to promote and encourage industry and frugality and discourage all manner of luxury and extravagance. Signing the agreement meant that you would no longer import certain goods from England, including many textiles above a certain price. It also suggested opting not to slaughter the sheep and keep them for wool instead. Other colonies soon took the practice in hand, to thinking that reducing this trade would put pressure on the British and potentially result in Parliament repealing all of the taxes. Choosing to wear homespun clothing now became a political choice. It represented an act of defiance against the crown. And much like today when we stick signs in our yards during election years, it stated your political leanings to your neighbors. But because of the stigma related to weaving your own fabric, it took patriotic, feminine-presenting people to turn the tides and make it fashionable. Why? Because women controlled the household purchases. They also, in towns, ran their own shops. Though they had little say in all of the political decision-making, they could make their voices be heard through consumption, and by boycotting British goods in favor of American homespun, or by giving up imported luxury items completely. To quote Carol Birkin, Parliament could not ignore Assembly's petitions. It could turn a deaf ear to soaring oratory and flights of rhetoric, but Parliament could not withstand the pressures placed on it by English merchants and manufacturers who saw their sales plummet and their warehouses overflow because of the boycott. Women boycotting British goods is what led to the repeal of the Stamp Act in 1769. This taxed every single piece of paper they used in the colonies. But then the passing of the Townshend Acts, which taxed things like paper, paints, glass, and tea, added more fuel to the fire in the homespun movement. In order to popularize the consumption of homespun, the organization, referred to as the Daughters of Liberty, began hosting spinning bees, which were large public events where people could gather to spin yarn for hours. Thanks to these social events and politically inclined feminine-presenting people, the thoughts around homespun began to change. Many took pride in wearing their homespun, and it was one of the ways that people from different social and economical backgrounds could come together. It was less about the individual and more about the whole. I mean, the group as a whole. It became so popular that at a ball in December of 1769, more than 100 women wore gowns of homespun. The Virginia Gazette reported, "The same patriotic spirit which gave rise to the associations of the gentlemen was most agreeably manifested in the dress of the ladies, and that all assemblies of American ladies would exhibit a like example of public virtue and private economy so amiably united." Even George Washington's inaugural suit was made out of brown homespun wool. And in 1774, when trade with England ended, homespun went from being just a political statement to a necessity, and all the work that women had done to change the popular mindset turned into a real way to support the army during the war by producing homespun for the military and creating a sound economic foundation for victory. And if you're enjoying this video, how about giving this video a thumbs up and saying hello in the comments? These little things go a long way into getting this video out to people like you, and it's greatly appreciated. If you have the means to contribute further, I do have a Ko-fi page, which I've linked to below. My awesome supporters over there are revered even more than our buddy Paul, and are probably much better at coming up with puns than I am. Also, we have a Discord. The link to the Discord has been expired, and finally somebody said something to me, so if you've been wanting to join and you haven't been able to get in, it should be working now. So I thought it'd be fun to dive a little deeper into this subject, but with friends. So I invited my buddy Tiffany to join me in talking about the homespun movement. And also because this video was her idea, like literally she texted me last week and was like, "Hey, you should do this as a video." And I was like, "Hey, I've never heard of that before." Okay.
We're here with Tiffany. Tiffany, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, I am Tiffany of Stitch and Addiction. Thank you so much for having me, Jackie. I love historical fashion, and I also love the other things that go with it, like the actual history and the politics and all of the many aspects that led to why people wore what they wore when they did and why fashion changed. So that's just a little bit about me.
Cool. So you have done some very interesting and very quick reading and want to share some things with us about the topic today. You were saying that you read a little bit about the history of textiles in Britain.
textiles were a man's work in the 17th and 18th centuries, and every little bitty step was broken down, and each one was done by a specialized worker. The workers were all parts of the guilds, and so these guild regulations forbade weavers from even employing their female relatives in the craft. They couldn't even allow them to help them, basically. And so I know, big eye roll. And so men were basically doing all of this. And then, as of course we know, the textile mills started coming in during the Industrial Revolution. That started to change in Britain. But one of the really interesting things we see is with the US, it was almost exclusively done by women from a very early point in our history. And part of that is because there were, like, say, a weaver, a master weaver would, immigrate over here, or he would be taught by his father, but then at a certain point he was having trouble getting apprentices and keeping them. And so then he just started teaching like his daughters, and then his daughters eventually took it over and passed on the craft to other women. And so it kind of made a transition, especially in New England. Apparently Pennsylvania kept it like as a men's craft much longer, but New England in particular, the men started going toward other careers like working in wood, working in silver, all of those different things. So it's really interesting how the Americans really kind of were the first ones where women took that over from the very bottom before it even became textile mills here in the United States.
It's really interesting that we were kind of in there from the ground running,
Right. Part of it was because men could be landowners. In England, of course, they couldn't be a lot of times, depending on their status and their birth and everything. And so they were more interested in running the land and pursuing, like I said, other crafts. And so it just kind of fell by the wayside. It was interesting too that weaving became like a side thing for farmers. Apparently, like in the dead of winter, New England farmers would do a little bit of weaving, but it was just usually when there was like nothing else going on their land. And so they would use that time in like December and January and get some cloth woven that they could either use for themselves and their families, or they could sell to make a little side income. Of course, all of this was, mostly just home. Like, this is for you. You might sell a little bit for a little side income. You're not really selling it. You're definitely not exporting it or anything like that, because Britain had passed legislation to forbid the export of textile machinery and even the immigration of people who had knowledge about how to run textile machinery. They wanted to keep all of that Industrial Revolution progress to themselves, and they did not want to share it with the colonies. And so it's interesting because it wasn't very long after the war that our textile mills started to become a thing. They started actually offering bounties for anybody who would immigrate over here that had knowledge of how to do textile mills and textile machinery. And finally, in the late 1780s, this guy named Samuel Slater, he couldn't resist the bounty. And so he passed himself off as a farmer. He completely memorized the Arkwright water frame and came over here and worked with another businessman and got the first textile mill going here in the United States in 1790. And then from there, it just took off into, of course, the whole history of textile mills.
Interesting.
It's really interesting because thinking about they're buying all of their cloth. And I get we talk about this on a regular basis. They didn't have near as many clothes as we did and all of that stuff, but they're buying all of their cloth basically overseas, except for, like I said, the farmers and some of the everyday people that are producing some for themselves to wear. But everybody else, especially the people that had a little bit more money and a little more status, were buying literally everything from Britain. And of course, that was by design. Britain wanted it that way.
I keep picturing the king from Hamilton, just sitting on his throne, spitting as he talks, planning all of this. I'm sure it's obviously that's just my brain being weird. That's not how it happened, but it makes me laugh.
Exactly.
It is really interesting. I never knew before that this was a whole thing and how much textiles played into all of the things that happened afterwards.
When I first started diving into this topic, the quick summaries I was reading, and, I actually first saw the piece that I sent you, at a museum, it kind of made it sound like that homespun wasn't really a thing in the Americas and the colonies until the late 1760s, right? But that actually wasn't true when I started diving in. Beginning of textiles starting here actually was in the 1640s, because the English Civil War interrupted trade. And so some people were like, well, I need new clothes somehow, some way. And so they started doing some spinning and weaving a little bit, just enough to get by until things settled back down and they started being able to get their cloth again. But this kind of slowly led into the buildup that kind of climaxed in really ultimately in 1769 with all of the spinning parties that they started having. The women in the 1640s, they would spin the flax or the wool, and then they would take that to a neighbor who had a loom, usually a man who was like a master weaver, and he would weave the cloth. But by the 1730s, the number of looms in New England homes had tripled. And that's kind of due to what I was saying earlier, was because the men started not being able to find enough male apprentices to take on the craft and really learn it. It passed on to the daughters. So then more and more daughters started getting looms in their homes. This is where, like we said, it kind of transferred into a women's art, but it was still just for what you needed. It was in the late 1760s that you have the spinning parties by the Daughters of Liberty. And these were not people that had to spin to wear it. Like, they didn't need the thread they were spinning. They did not need the cloth that was being woven. They were doing this as a political statement. And it seems to be, from my research, the earliest point when women could really come out in America and be involved in politics. It was one of the first ways they were able to do that, because it was still within their gendered roles, right? You're still doing spinning and weaving, but it is still a demonstration to raise awareness, number one, about the boycott, let's not buy stuff from Britain, but also they would do spinning demonstrations, it seems like, with the point of like teaching other people how to do it. It was really interesting. They would do spinning races, see who could spin the most amount in the shortest amount of time. It sounds like really fun. Like, they used to have a lot of frolics, and work parties then. And so they basically just took that idea and turned it into a political movement to be able to spread the word, basically, and say, hey, don't buy your cloth from them, use homespun.
I was remarking, I'm reading a book right now, of course I am, and there's copious amounts of use of the word homespun, and it's very clear to me, especially now having done all this research, like, the author has no idea what homespun actually is. She has no idea what a lot of things are. But this particular, like, throwing it out there just willy-nilly without, really understanding what the concept of homespun is. And it's funny how when you research something that you really didn't know about before, and then all of a sudden you see it everywhere.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it was interesting when I was studying original Regency dresses a couple of weeks ago in Concord, Massachusetts. One of the dresses from the 1820s was like, I want to say 1818, 1820. I can't remember the exact year for it. They had just started putting the facings in the hems in Regency dresses at that point, and it was made of homespun. It wasn't made of plain cotton like a lot of the other ones we were seeing. It was made out of a homespun cloth, which was pretty cool to see.
Yeah, that is cool.
The other fun thing that I kind of came across in all of this was the contrast between the Sons of Liberty and the Daughters of Liberty. So the Daughters of Liberty were hosting these spinning parties, right? And it was really interesting because they would do it in a way that would benefit the host. So like, they would have to have some place that would host them for these parties, right? And so they would pick somebody that kind of needed some extra help. Like, in one example, they picked a guy who had recently been widowed and he had like 5 small children. And then when they were done spinning all of that, they would leave the spun thread with him, and then he could do what he wanted with it, whether it was sell it and make money off of it or get it woven or whatever. There was another example where there was a lady in the community who had recently had some health issues and was getting older and had always been like very helpful in the community prior to her health issues. And so they held it at her house and then donated it to her when they were done. They would do it at churches sometimes and donate it to the church. What was funny was you've got the Daughters of Liberty with their spinning parties and helping the community and raising awareness. And it said that it contrasted sharply with the Sons of Liberty, who were indulging in rum, rhetoric, and roast pig and causing havoc in the streets at night on their way home, versus the Daughters of Liberty, who are spinning as much as they can, then donating it and going home by sundown.
Okay, but there is one of those that sounds a lot more fun than the other to me.
And I thought it was really interesting because it's like they probably had to do it that way to, you know, be able to keep doing it, right? If they had tried anything as miraculous as the men, then it would have, you know, blown up in their face and they wouldn't have been allowed to do it. So, you know, they were very careful with this opportunity that had arisen, but I just thought the contrast was very funny too.
That is hilarious, and you're totally right. You know, it's that thing where you have to be twice as good as the other, because otherwise they'll find a reason to shut you down. It makes total sense.
So if you want to learn any more about this whole era, besides of course what else Jackie is telling you in this video, but a lot of my information I got from The Age of Homespun. It's a super cool book that traces the whole journey of women's involvement in textiles from very early American settlement or colonization into about the time that the textile mills really kind of took over here in the US, which, by the way, by the 1850s, there were 40,000 American women employed in textile mills. Just a little fact for your day.
Wow. Cool. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for sharing all of your knowledge with us. This was a lot of fun.
It was. Thank you so much for having me. That was a good time.
Yay. All right. We'll see you. We'll talk to you later.
See you later. Bye.
Hey, if you've enjoyed this video, why not watch another one? If you feel like history is repeating itself, why not check out this video here where I talk about repeating historical fashion trends? Or, if you like my outfit, why not check out this video where I made this dress, which features one of my all-time favorite reveal scenes of all time. That's it for me. Thanks for watching. I love y'all, and I'll catch you in my next video.